Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. It's time for part 2 of our Week 8 start sit. Already had the fun Thursday game, Packers-Cardinals. That was really insane. I mean, first things first, we just got to give it to the Packers without Devontae Adams or basically any of their receivers. Pulled off a win against, at the time, undefeated team. They got to at least be top 3, right? They're playing really well right now. One thing I want to say before we get into this is, sorry, it's coming out late. We're recording this on a Saturday afternoon. Again, it's just been another hectic week for those of you who, kind of watching some of our last videos. There's some reasons, and there's a lot going on right now, but we're still here, still got some research for you, so let's get right into the games. First game I'd like to talk about is the Patriots at the Chargers. Now, last game was a big game for Mac Jones, the rookie throwing 300 yards. He looked really good. In fact, he's had a quarterback rating of 111 or higher in 3 of his last 4 games. He's playing really well. I still would not start him. He's 22nd in fantasy scoring. In fact, his best performance was 11th, so barely cracking that top 12. And he plays one of the toughest pass defenses in the league, which is the Chargers pass defense. So for me, I'm going to sit Mac Jones, but I am excited to watch him. I'm really, I'm curious to see if he's, how he's going to handle that matchup. A guy you have to start is Damian Harris. Over the last 3 games, he has been phenomenal. What has he got, like 3 straight games of just dominant production, 4 touchdowns in 3 games, back-to-back games over 100 yards. And what's crazy about it is he had 5.6 and 7.6 yards per carry. He's just been lights out. Damian Harris is a must-start running back. Just to talk briefly more about that backfield, Brandon Bolden has really taken over that James White role. He has some PPR value. In fact, last game, he saw 7 targets and made 6 catches for 79 yards and a touchdown out of it. But I still wouldn't start him. Really just not consistent production, not enough volume there. But he's a guy to keep your eye on, and I do want to point that out because I feel like it was a big enough game for him. If we don't mention it, people will wonder why we didn't talk about it. He's got some value. Keep your eye on him, but don't start him. Of course, you need to sit all Patriots wide receivers. Here's really the stat that you need to know. Their number 1 fantasy receiver is Jacoby Myers. He scored more points than any other Patriots receiver, and he hasn't scored a touchdown all year. That really tells you all you need to know about their fantasy value.
His whole career.
Yeah, that's it's rough being a Patriots fan or a Patriots wide receiver at this point. But the one guy you can't start is Hunter Henry. He is really turning it on. Took him a while to get into that offense. Plus, he's got a rookie quarterback developing. But he is 5th in tight end scoring over the last 3 games. He has been just hound at finding the end zone. I don't know what it is, but last couple of games he's found some great chemistry with his QB. So I would start him. I would sit their kicker Nick Folk, and I would sit the Patriots defense this week. Taking a look at the other side of things, what about the Chargers? Justin Herbert. He's currently 12th in quarterback scoring, so he's right on that bubble on the season. But he goes against the Patriots, giving up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. I'd actually say to sit Herbert this week. He's played phenomenal this year. He's been fun to watch, but there's not a ton of fantasy value there. He's not going to be bad enough that you should drop him or make big waiver claims to get rid of him or find a replacement. You don't want to be dropping talent to get a 1-week quarterback fix. He'll be good enough, but if you already have another quarterback or wasted spot on your bench, then definitely do it. What about Austin Eckler? Here's what you need to know right now. He's currently questionable, but he actually felt sore after Wednesday's practice and didn't practice for consecutive games, both Thursday and Friday. So I have a feeling he is not going to be playing, though I think he's a game-time decision. So I would monitor that, but I don't think he'll be playing. In replacement, really the back who got the most carries there so far, other than Eckler, has been Larry Roundtree. He saw 11 carries just a few games ago. But in that game, he had just 3 yards per carry. I'm actually going to say to sit all running backs in that situation. Of course, if Eckler starts, he's a must-start running back. But any of those backups, I would avoid. You need to start Mike Williams. He's wide receiver 12 on the year, 6 touchdowns in 6 games. He's a must-start. Keenan Allen is a must-start as a wide receiver 3. It's not a great matchup, and really his only problem is that he just has 1 touchdown on the year. If it weren't for some of those other guys, I think he'd have scored a few more times. Jared Cook, I would sit him. Patriots give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to tight ends. He's only 16th on the year in fantasy scoring. And get this, the Patriots have only allowed 1 tight end this year more than 2 catches in a game. That's how good they've been. Their linebacking core is phenomenal. Dustin Hopkins, I would start him, and I would sit the Chargers defense.
So I've got the Jaguars and the Seahawks. I like to start with the quarterbacks. So I'll start with Geno Smith. So far, he has been pretty filling in for Russell Wilson there. He's averaging 169 passing yards per game and 1 touchdown pass. He hasn't been horrible, but he hasn't been great. But if you look at the game, it's a must-win situation for Seattle going at 2-5. If they are going to at all compete, they've got to win this game. Hopefully, they can get Russell Wilson back. He also has a great matchup. They allow the 12th most points to quarterbacks. The only quarterback that went against them that didn't have a huge fantasy day is Ryan Tannehill. And the reason why he didn't is, one, it was a blowout. Going into the third quarter, it was 31-13, the Titans, and they had 3 rushing touchdowns for Henry. And so quarterbacks have been just lighting up the Jaguars' defense. Other than that, the Jags have allowed over 300 passing yards per game minus Tannehill, and that was to Bridgewater, Tua, and Tyrod Taylor. Certainly those guys are not all pros. But here's the thing. It's still Geno Smith. They're running a conservative offense. So you probably have better options there than starting him. But I would say if you're in daily fantasy, he's a guy worth a cheap start there. So I wouldn't start for regular fantasy, but for daily, yeah, give it a shot. Trevor Lawrence continues to make strides, gets better. In his first 3 games, he completed 54.2% of his throws, averaging 5.7 yards per attempt, committing 9 turnovers, 7 interceptions, 2 fumbles. It was not pretty, right?
Yeah.
Last 3 games, that completion percentage went up 12 points to 66.3%. He's averaging 8.1 yards per attempt and only 2 turnovers in those 3 games. So you can definitely see the reason why he was the first overall pick. He's getting better. Mm-hmm. But one, his weapons are not great there per se. And James Robinson has run the ball really, really well. We'll get to that in a bit. That means he'll have to throw the ball less. And so even with his improvement there, Trevor Lawrence is coming along. For me, he's still outside the top 12 as far as quarterbacks go. You would sit him in most leagues. You could start him in a league of 14 teams or over if you need to do that. Now let's shift a little bit. And another thing to consider, too, when you talk about quarterback plays, I think what's going to happen is that Seahawks will want to run the ball a lot there. And, of course, I think make a lower-scoring game, avoid a shootout. And so let's talk about the running game for Seattle. Let's talk about running backs, Alec Collins. We actually saw a report today. We said it a few weeks ago. Even before he went in the IR, we said neck injuries are tricky. I've seen this last an entire year. They're hard to heal up. And now today a report comes out that he doesn't look good, Chris Carson.
Yeah.
So Alec Collins is definitely a guy looking for. But in this matchup here, one, he's questionable with a groin injury. So you're going to have to monitor that. Looks like he's likely to play. But if he does play, he could be limited or one play away from worsening that injury. Now, I think they want to run the ball a ton with Wilson out, but he carries risk in this game because he's not 100%. They're going to fill the box, and his production efficiency is down right now. I would say he's worth a start. Alec Collins, if he plays, you could start him in larger leagues as a flex option, but you got to monitor that injury. Watch that Sunday morning. As far as the other 2 backs, you got Dallas DJ, and you got Penny. Penny returned last week. He struggled. Dallas didn't even get a touch. And the Jaguars are going to load the box, try to shut down that run, try to force Geno there. So I would only consider playing Penny if Collins sits, and then he'd still be a very low running back 3, so not a great option there. As far as James Robinson goes, man, you were really hard for this guy in the offseason the first week. You were like losing your mind, right, when they didn't play him?
Oh, I was so frustrated. You know what happened? It was so funny. They drafted Travis Etienne. Everyone was like selling on James Robinson. And I was like, no, he's going to be fine. He's going to be fine. Well, of course, Etienne gets hurt. People were still not big on Robinson. And then week 1 happens. I thought, man, am I really wrong? But sure enough, he's been great.
Yeah, you traded for him in a Dynasty League, and I'm glad that you did. This coaching staff has got to see that this guy can be your running back. Right now he's playing Seattle on the second most points to running backs. He's got 5.5 yards per carry. In the last 4 weeks that he's played, okay, he's got the number 1 rating by Pro Football Focus among running backs, number 1. His yards per contact, 4.41, is second behind only Jonathan Taylor, and he's 6th in elusive rating. Man, this guy's a stud. Start him in all leagues, even PPRs, because he's good in the passing game. So just go ahead and play that guy. As far as wide receivers go, let's look at the Jags wide receiver, Shenault. His targets are pretty high, but his production's just not there. Yeah. They're not equaling that production. And then to make matters worse, Jamal Agnew is starting to get touches and targets, and so it's kind of making that usage and role a little bit blurry. And so for both of those guys, Agnew and Shenault, I would actually sit them both until you have one more week to clarify what's happening. If you got to start a guy, there'd be Marvin Jones. Last week he goes out, had 100 yards, 7 touchdowns. 7 touchdowns. That'd be a big game, right? 7 catches and a touchdown. He's got 3 touchdowns on the year, so he's a guy that you could play. To me, he's their safest wide receiver, and I would start him as a wide receiver 3 in that one. The wide receivers for Seattle, Metcalf. Now his targets are down, his production's down, but he is so talented. Like you saw last week, he doesn't need that many catches to be productive, and he's dangerous around the goal line. In the last 3 weeks, he's had 2 games over 90 receiving yards, even though the targets and the receptions aren't there. Yeah. So he's a guy that loses some value with Geno at quarterback, but he's still wide receiver 2 start. And then there's Tyler Lockett. Man, I like this guy. I feel terrible. He started so hot this year, but with Wilson out, you got to sit him. He's just not there. The production's not there. I would sit the Seattle tight ends. And let's look at the tight end, Dan Arnold for the Jaguars. There's a lot of owners out there have a lot of confidence that he's going to be a good tight end and their tight end in the future. But right now, besides one game, the stats are not there. I would sit him.
Yeah.
I would sit both kickers. Now you could consider starting Seattle's defense if Russell Wilson was the quarterback. But in this game, it's going to be lower scoring, and they're not going to be able to pin back their ears. It'll be conservative. And so I'd actually sit both defenses in this game.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of those matchups where, the injury to Wilson and the game script probably going to be very heavy to the run. It's not just about knowing the teams. You got to know what this specific week is going to look like. That's drastically going to change the value of those guys. All right, next up, I want to get into the BUCS at the Saints. Going to be a really fun matchup here. Let's start talking about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. What about Tom Brady? He is insane. Of course, we already know this, but he has either 4 or 5 touchdowns in 4 of his 7 games. That means you have like a 60% chance for him to get you 4 or 5 scores. That's insane. He's top 5 in scoring in 5 of 7 games. And this is a little bit tougher matchup. Yeah, the Saints give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but here's the last couple quarterbacks they've played. Sam Darnold, Mac Jones, Daniel Jones, Tyler Heineke, and Geno Smith. Needless to say, Tom Brady is head and shoulders above all those quarterbacks, or even probably more than that. So it's going to be a great game for him. Start Brady. You also need to start both Evans and Godwin. Because Gronk is out and Antonio Brown is out, that removes the only concern that anyone ever had with those guys, which was volume. Sure enough, Evans had 3 touchdowns last game. He's got 5 scores in the last 3 games. Both of these guys are must start, especially against the Saints, giving up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. I would sit both Cameron Brate and Howard there. We'll see, of course, if Gronk returns, and when he returns, he's going to be a startable tight end. But until that day, I would just sit all tight ends in that situation. I would start Suckup, and I would start the defense there for the Buccaneers. They're quietly the 3rd best fantasy scoring defense, and I think they're going to have a good day against an inconsistent Jameis Winston. Speaking of Jameis Winston, let's break it down. Let's go to the Saints now. I would sit him. Here's the thing. He had a big week 1, and he's had 2 really good games. But get this. He has only had 1 top 15 fantasy finish in the last 6 weeks. 1. He has been brutal. In fact, he has 0 300-yard passing games. It's not his fault. He doesn't have the weapons, but the problem still remains the same. He just doesn't have the weapons, and until that changes, for me, he's a sit. Of course, Alvin Kamara is a must start. Somebody said to me recently they were disappointed in how Alvin Kamara's played this year. He's been phenomenal.
Yeah.
I don't understand
He's their best back and their best wide receiver.
Yeah, he is 7th in fantasy scoring despite having a bye week. Now, there's a fair number of players who've had a bye week, but get this. 4 of these 6 players ahead of him have had an extra game than him, and one of them, Aaron Jones, has had 2 extra games than him. So, yeah, he is clearly a top 5 fantasy running back. So it's so funny. We get our expectations so high. Speaking of the Saints, we'll move on to the wide receivers. I would sit all their wide receivers. We've said this for weeks now. Nothing changes. I would sit their tight ends, their kicker, and their defense. Just keep that nice and simple. Anything to add there, Rob?
No. Let's take a look at the Broncos versus Washington football team. Gosh, I can't say that. Please get a name and don't say it. Don't say it. So let's start with quarterbacks. Tyler Heineke there. He's had 4 good games fantasy-wise and 3 bad ones. But the last 3 games he's trending down where the Denver defense is good. They allow the 3rd fewest points to quarterbacks. I would sit him in this one. Now look at Teddy Bridgewater. Teddy Bridgewater has actually been a good quarterback for them. But in fantasy terms, he's only really had 2 good games. Now Washington, though, allows the most points to quarterbacks. Look at the last 5 games versus them. They're allowing 3.4 touchdown passes per game. 3 weeks in a row, they actually allowed 4 touchdown passes per game. So if you need to stream a quarterback this week, he's a guy that's worth a start against Denver there. Now look in the running back situation, you got Gibson. I got Gibson, you got Gibson. He's been a little bit disappointed. I think some of that is just the fact that he's not 100%. He's playing with a hairline fracture in his shin, but he's still playing. Now he's playing Denver, allowing the 7th fewest points to backs. Now with the injury to his shin, the carries are still there, the volume is there, but he's clearly the lead back, but in terms of the passing game, we notice that his usage is dropping, his effectiveness is down. But he's still getting the carries, so you got to start him as a low-end running back, too. I made the mistake because he was questionable and he was not playing 100%, and I sat him, and he didn't have a great effective game, but he had 2 touchdowns. And so he's a guy that I think you probably don't have a better option as an RB2. Start him. You got McKissick in there. McKissick is a backup running back, and this is a guy that has value in PPR leagues. He's got very good hands, but his usage is up and down from week to week. So he's a guy that typically you could start in PPR leagues as a flex or teams over 14, league size over 14 teams.
Yeah.
But I think this week is not a great play. It'd be better to sit him if you could afford to do that. Then you look at the running backs for the Broncos there. You got Gordon and Williams. And for all year, this has been almost a perfect running back by committee, splitting down the middle. But Williams seems to be edging ahead of Gordon a little bit in terms of effectiveness. But they're still going to make sure that both of those guys carry the ball quite a bit. So barring an injury, assuming that they both play, I would sit Gordon. Williams is a flex consideration or in running back 2 in very large leagues. In redraft leagues, if you had one of those guys and I was in a redraft league, obviously Williams in a dynasty league or keeper league is great.
Yeah.
But I'd probably try to trade out of that situation because I think you're going to see this all year.
Yeah.
I don't know if one, barring an injury, is going to really distance themselves. Going to the wide receivers, Terry McLaurin, Scary Terry, love this guy. The Denver pass defense is good, but he's a wide receiver 1. He's by far their best weapon. He's a must start. There's really not much to say there. And then look at the wide receivers for the Broncos. Jerry Jeudy, there's thought that he might come off the IR this week. Now it looks like maybe not this week, so we'll have to wait and see. If he does start, he's a stud, and Washington has the second most points to wide receivers, so if he does play, you got to play him.
Yeah.
But it looks like he's going to sit. Assuming he sits, start Sutton. With him out, he's a strong wide receiver 2 play. Courtland Sutton is there.
Yeah, he's a productive wide receiver, and it's about volume. If Jeudy is out, he's going to see a ton of targets.
Yeah. Now, if Jeudy does happen to come back, I would still start Sutton. You just need to lower him down. Instead of a strong wide receiver 2, he's a low-end wide receiver 2, but I would play both of those guys against there. I would sit all other wide receivers. As far as tight ends, we got Seals Jones. He's had 10 catches, 109 yards in the last 2 games. And with the tight end position being weak and injuries piling up, there's another injury to tight end now. We get Robert Tanya's out. So, it's hard to find a good tight end. He's a guy worth the play. The matchup is not favorable. They give up the 4th fewest points to tight ends, but who you got out there that you can really plug and play in this one? Probably not. So he's a decent play with a lower ceiling. As far as Noah Fant goes, he's a safe tight end 1, strong floor, but lower ceiling. He's a guy that's pretty solid. I think he'll have a decent career and a good future. He's not a great play. He's certainly not Travis Kelce, but he's decent. As far as kickers go, I would sit both kickers. I think Denver D is worth a start, but I would sit Washington's defense in this one.
All right, now we got to talk about the Cowboys versus the Vikings. Just another tough matchup for the Vikings. Feels like they've lost quite a few close games to good teams. Maybe they'll come out with a win against this one in this game. But let's get into it. Cowboys first. Dak Prescott is a clear must start. He's got 13 touchdowns in the last 4 games. In fact, he has 3 or more touchdowns in 5 of his 6 games. He's almost guaranteed to get you 3 TDs and 300 yards.
Yeah, no, he played through his injury last game. And it seemed to me that the guy's going to come out and play Sunday night, right?
Yeah.
But then I was hearing some reports that there's a possibility that he may not play in that game. Have you found anything on that?
No, see, that's exactly what I was going to get to. It's one of those things. The NFL has been doing it a lot this year, and it's very frustrating for fantasy owners. I haven't heard a whole lot about that. It's starting to seem like maybe he won't play, but you also know that the Cowboys are competitors. Maybe the biggest reason he won't play is that the division's not very competitive and they're not desperate for a win.
Here's the big problem with that. It's a Sunday night game.
Yeah.
If that was Sunday morning, you could watch reports, sit him, grab another guy. You don't know, but he's so good. I'm hoping he sits, if no other reason, for my Minnesota Vikings.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's hypothetical. You own Dak Prescott in the league. What do? Sunday morning, you're just going to check it, and then do you wait or do you risk it or?
Yeah, I think that depends upon what you have on your bench. You could pick up a guy, but a lot like me right now, there's nobody on my bench I want to let go of. It's guys that I need are solid. And I like to start him if I could. And so a lot of it, who am I playing? What's his score? What do I have out there? That is so dependent on the person. But I would probably wait. I guess the worst case scenario is you can pick up his backup if you want that night. Or take a look at Monday's game and see if they're available.
Who knows? Moving on to the other guys, Zeke, he's an obvious start. He's top 14 in fantasy scoring in 5 games straight. So weekly fantasy scoring, 5 games in a row, he's been at least 14th. He is a solid RB1. He has played phenomenal. Start him. You also got to start both Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. Man, watching CeeDee Lamb last game, they're coming off a bye, so two weeks ago, that was phenomenal. 11 targets, 9 catches, 149 yards, and 2 TDs for 41 fantasy points. He is really taking off as, to be quite honest, probably the wide receiver 1, maybe even over Cooper. Either way, those guys both have huge value, and you should start them both. But even more surprising than Lamb has got to be Dalton Schultz. The way that he has played is phenomenal. He's basically averaging you 6 catches for 80 yards and just under a touchdown over the last 5 weeks. And he is the tight end number 5 in fantasy scoring, despite the fact that every other top 7 tight end has an extra game than him. I mean, he is just playing electric right now. He's right up there with every other guy. I would start him. I would start their kicker, Greg Zuerlein. And I'm going to sit the Cowboys defense this week. Looking at the Vikings, Kirk Cousins, an interesting guy. He's someone to consider playing this week in this matchup. He's certainly underrated, and he's basically got a 50-50 chance this year to score you 3 touchdowns and finish within the top 6 in fantasy scoring. He is highly dependent on matchup. Teams with good defenses that want to run the ball and slow the pace, the Vikings are okay doing that. But as soon as a team like the Cowboys wants to put up a lot of points, they can do that as well. They might not win it, but they can
that's
score
where,
some points.
if you've got Cousins, you want Dak Prescott to play, who's going to score a lot of points for, force Kirk Cousins to throw a lot. And I actually have Kirk Cousins. So maybe there's a benefit to Dak Prescott playing and moving up the over-under on that game.
Yeah, I was just going to say that if Dak plays, I think you really should start Kirk Cousins this week. You also need to start Dalvin Cook. Now, he's been banged up this year, but in the 3 games he's played and been healthy, he is the RB3 in fantasy scoring, and he's gotten over 100 yards in all of those games. There's just no arguing it. He is an elite fantasy back. He's a must-play guy. Of course, you got to start Adam Thielen and Justin Jefferson. They are both top 16 in fantasy scoring. In fact, no other team has 2 wide receivers in the top 20. These guys are insane. They've been playing like on fire lately. Play both Thielen and Jefferson. I would sit Tyler Conklin, start the kicker Greg Joseph, and if Dak Prescott is out, you can start the Vikings defense. Otherwise, I would sit them.
And our final game, Monday night game, we got the Giants versus the Chiefs. Now, you talked about Dak Prescott being out Sunday night. What do you do? Well, here's an option for you. The guy that's readily available in a lot of leagues out there is Daniel Jones.
Yeah.
He's a guy that you could pick up if you can't play Dak Prescott. He's playing Kansas City on the second most points to quarterbacks. That defense is a mess right now. Kansas City's a little bit of a mess right now overall as a team. Now, I think he'd be a nice play this week. And the only concern I have for Daniel Jones is interest to the wide receivers, but I still think he's a solid play because they have a lot of depth there. Even if it go down to Ross and Pettis, those guys are decent wide receivers. Yeah. And the nice thing about him is Daniel Jones will get you points with his legs often, rushing touchdowns, yards like that. Now, he struggled against the Dallas and he struggled against the Rams, but I think this week he rebounds. So he's a guy that you could start if you need to fill in this week. If your regular starter is out, he does have a good matchup. If your starter's out or has an unfavorable matchup there. Pat Mahomes, he's not typical Pat Mahomes. They have some issues there, undoubtedly, but he's still 5th in quarterback scoring right now, and he's still quarterback 1. So just start the guy. I know you're a little disappointed, he's not what he used to be, but he's still Pat Mahomes having a great year. Stop your crying and whining. You got a good quarterback, you big baby. Play him. Let's look at the running back for Kansas City, Williams. Last 3 games, he's kind of had 2 stinkers in there and then 1 good play in the last 3 games. But with Clyde Edwards-Helaire out of there, and he is the team's lead back. Now, unfortunately, the Chiefs rarely stick to the run. I think that's one of the problems they're having right now is they got to get back establishing the run.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, they're not doing that. But he's a guy that is going to use, and Williams is useful in the passing game, so he does have that sort of value. Now, I don't think the Giants are going to dominate scoring. They're not going to take a big lead. So Kansas City, I think, will be able to at least stick with the run a little bit more than they have in the last few games. They won't have to abandon it. So I think for me, when I look at him, he's a flex start or an RB3. That's where I kind of put him at. Now let's look at Booker, the running back for New York. New York's going to try to run the ball, I think, a lot and keep the ball out of Pat Mahomes' hands. Whether or not they can do that, we'll see. Kansas City can be run on. In fact, if you look at Booker, last 3 games had double-digit points in PPR scoring amongst running backs. So to me, he's a running back to start. Tyreek Hill, you don't have to research it even. Just start that guy, honestly. The other wide receivers for Kansas City, don't play Russian roulette. Stop trying to figure that out. It's a mess. You never know from week to week. Even Mecole Hardman, who's had a little uptick in some of his usage lately, still not great. So just stay away from them. As far as the Giants wide receiver go, you got Shepard, Tooney, Slayton, Pettis, Ross, Galladay. Here's what I would say. Whoever plays in that offense there, wide receiver-wise, the top 2 guys are worth starting. So here's what I'm going to tell you. This is what we're going to do differently. I'm going to give you my order of the receivers, and then whichever top 2 end up playing in that game, you can start those guys as wide receiver 2 or 3, depending upon your league size. And here's how I order these guys right here. Of all those wide receivers, number 1 has got to be Tooney. That guy's a stud. Now, he's a little bit lower in this one because he's got an injury. It looks like he's going to play, but probably less than 100%.
Yeah.
Number 2 is Shepard. He's the number 2 guy there, reliable, been good. Number 3 is Slayton. 4, Pettis. 5 is Ross. And then, of course, 6 is Galladay, but Galladay is out. And so that's the order. And I would look on that team there. They're going to be playing catch up. They're going to have to throw the ball. And whatever those top 2 guys that end up playing, because there's a lot of injuries and question marks there, those guys will get good volume. And those are the guys I would feel free to start as a wide receiver 2 or 3, depending on your league size. Travis Kelce, I don't know if you should start him. Maybe you should trade him to me, because right now my tight end production hasn't been that great. Start the guy, right? Evan Kyle Rudolph is just a role player at this point, and Evan Ingram is a perennial disappointment. Can I say that? He showed promise as a rookie, but since then he hasn't been there. I just don't trust him at this point, even though this is a game where we could have an uptick in production. I guess if you're really, really desperate, you could go with him, but I'd prefer to look otherwise. I would sit the Giants kicker, start Buckner, and sit both defenses in this game.